Hey everybody, this is Mr. Moppa coming at you with another APUSH video. This time taking a look at topic 7.4, focusing in on the progressives. So previously, we were looking at, defining who the progressives were, taking a look at, what their kind of general goals were in terms of trying to use the powers of government to reform society at the turn of the 20th century. Now, don't forget that the Muckrakers are going to play a critical role in this process. We're talking about, journalists, writers, using the media of the time before there was radio, television, and the internet to, be able to shine a light on what these problems are, to be able to, make the general public realize that these problems exist. If you don't make the general public realize that certain problems exist, how are you going to get the government active to try to solve these problems? Now, when we talk about these various muckrakers, you've got people like Ida Tarbell that is going to be exposing the shady, unethical business practices of how how Standard Oil is going to be operating. But you also had other examples. For example, you had Jacob Riis's "How the Other Half Lives," which shows through some pretty remarkable pictures that you're seeing here of what life is like in the urban slums of New York City at this time period. You're talking about a time where crime is rife, where people, really don't even have what you would call real apartments. Many of these folks lived in what you would consider to be tenement slums. Children that were homeless, not getting an education. You're talking about immigrants with no real options in many, many cases of what's going on. Basically folks living in just abject, inhumane examples of poverty. And in this process, the thing about what Riis does that's really, really good is, it's one thing to kind of use words to describe urban poverty. But if you are using, images of that poverty, it's certainly going to have a much stronger impact. No question about that. So, being able to bring attention to the need to, provide adequate housing for America's urbanites is going to be significant. You also had the impact of Lincoln Steffens, as you can see pictured here, in his The Shame of the Cities. He's going to be bringing about exposure to the problems associated with political corruption. This is going to be significant in terms of trying to rid America of the political machines that were endemic in the big cities at that time. You also had people like Frank Norris pictured here. That is going to be in his work, The Octopus, being able to expose the challenges that farmers will be facing when dealing with the railroad industry and how it was really manipulative and almost soul-crushing in terms of crushing the ability of mom-and-pop businesses of being able to compete with the large monopolies. But probably the most famous of them all is Upton Sinclair right here with his work, The Jungle, which is going to be exposing the just disgustingly horrific workplace conditions in Chicago's meatpacking plants, in addition to the truly revolting process by which processed meats were put together. It also exposed the pretty vile environmental or lack of environmental concern with these factories as well. In the case of The Jungle, in his explicit depiction of rats and feces and sawdust and rusted nails and all sorts of things ending up in the sausages that people would buy, kind of like with Riis using the photographs, Sinclair is going to do a very good job of really trying to be graphic, in terms of describing the chemical bubbles that come out of the Chicago River, and be able to kind of describe in great detail the rheumatoid arthritis that the workers would get working with acid without proper safety equipment, to really get people feeling like they got punched in the stomach in terms of realizing, oh my gosh, this is a real problem and we got to have the government get involved. So in many respects, these muckrakers are going to be kind of the troubadours of the progressive movement, sounding the alarm, bringing the attention to the American people and thereby the government in terms of what really needs to be addressed. Now, with that being said, we are going to start to see some attempts to make some changes that are going to be taking place. A lot of these changes are going to be centered in on reforming the electoral process. And this is going to be, mostly done at the state and local level. And to understand the kind of the general mantra of these progressives when it came to cleaning up government, you want to be mindful of the phrase, the cure for the ills of democracy is more democracy. And what that means is that, if you want to get rid of corruption, with political bosses and, these political machines that are running around like Tammany Hall, you got to give the people more power. If you make it easier for the people themselves to have a louder voice on electoral matters, then you're going to be able to, kind of disinfect what's going to be happening in terms of the corruption with government. So a lot of this is going to be predicated on that notion. One thing that's going to be a noticeable change is the adoption of what's going to be known as the Australian ballot, which is really the secret ballot. Prior to this, it was very common when folks went to go vote that you voted in public. So you, in many cases, went to the local precinct, which also in many cases doubled as the local party headquarters. And you would go down there and you would ask typically for a party ballot. In other words, you want the Republican or the Democrat ballot. Well, when you ask for a certain party's ballot, it's now public knowledge, who you voted for. And that could be used against you. For example, if you don't vote in line with the local party machine and they know it, well, guess what? Maybe your rent doubles, or maybe you lost your job, or, hey, your apartment catches on fire, and what do you know? The fire department doesn't show up. So the use of a secret ballot is going to allow people to have a freer opportunity to actually, independently make their voice heard on electoral matters. Something else that's going to be adopted is the use of direct primaries. Now, a direct primary is a way of choosing candidates that will be in the general election. For example, in the most recent presidential election, you had Joe Biden, the Democrat, against the incumbent Republican Donald Trump. Now, how did those two parties choose those two guys? How did Trump become the Republican nominee, and how did Biden become the Democrat nominee? Well, in the old days, that would have been done in, smoky back rooms of taverns, by some pretty shady, sketchy political bosses. And these folks tended to, nominate people based on, how corruptible they could be, how pliable they could be to be kind of be told what to do in terms of being having to engage in a willingness in unethical, if not criminal behavior. Well, what do the primaries do? Well, the primaries work like this. Instead of party bosses making these decisions, you are now, just like that, quote above says, you're letting the people decide who these nominees are going to be. The idea being is that, for example, on the Democrat side in the 2020 election, there were a number. In fact, there was like 20 different Democrats that ran for the party's nomination. It wasn't Joe Biden. It included other people like Kamala Harris, Pete Buttigieg, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and a whole slew of others. So how did Joe Biden end up getting the nomination? Well, all these candidates campaigned in all 50 states in the spring of 2020. And the candidate that got the most support in the states across America amongst the Democrats, which ended up being Joe Biden, gets the nomination. So the idea being is, instead of having party bosses choose the nominees, so you might have corrupt Democrat being chosen to go against corrupt Republican in the general election, which guarantees you a corrupt politician. Well, if the people decide, then there's going to be less of a likelihood that you're going to have an inherently corrupt politician, because you got something that the people want, not a political boss wants, what the people want. In addition to that, you also saw in 1913 the ratification of the 17th Amendment, which created a direct election for U.S. senators. The same idea that kind of goes along with direct primaries. Prior to the 17th Amendment, you might remember in the Constitution, it requires that U.S. senators be chosen by state legislatures. Well, that might be all fine and good, except if you've got state legislators that, may be corrupt because of how they got there through the party machine process. Well, if these corrupt politicians are going to be choosing that senator, pretty good chance they're going to pick a corrupt U.S. senator. So the idea being, once again, the cure for the ills of democracy is more democracy. Let the people decide. Direct election of U.S. senators. So now today, just like with House members, senators are also chosen directly by the people. Now, some additional reforms are going to be found purely at the state level. You've got initiatives, you've got referendums, and you've got recall power. Initiatives and referendums deal with legislation. An initiative is where the people are able to organize through a petition, and the petition, through signatures of registered voters in a given state, are going to, based on enough signatures, force the state legislature to vote on an issue. Like it might be an issue of legalizing marijuana. That issue might be, a little bit politically toxic that, a member of the state legislature might not want to, propose a bill to legalize marijuana, and therefore they kind of ignore the issue and don't address it. But if it's an important issue of the people, an initiative can force the legislature to vote on it, and therefore put elected officials on record on having to take a stand on an issue. A referendum is one step beyond an initiative. A referendum is also dealing with legislation, so we'll use the same example of legalizing marijuana again. But with a referendum, yes, it starts the same process. You get a petition going of signatures of registered voters in that state, but if you get enough signatures with a referendum, that legislative issue, in this case, let's say you legalize marijuana, goes directly to the people. And if the people vote, a majority of the people that vote yes for that, well, then that legislation becomes law, totally bypassing the legislature. Once again, the cure for the ills of democracy is more democracy. Here in Ohio, we have seen referendum power be used to, for example, legalize casino gambling. That's how we have it. That wasn't done by the Ohio General Assembly, our legislature. That was done by the people themselves via referendum. And then lastly, you also have what's called recall power. Recall power is the ability for the people to propose an action to remove an elected official in the middle of their term. In essence, it's kind of like a very specific, special type of referendum, except it's not legislation. It's to, as I said before, remove an elected official in the middle of their term instead of having to wait to the next general election. We have seen recalls be effective in American history. Probably still the most famous was the 2002 recall of California Governor Gray Davis. The way that it worked in California is that if you got enough signatures to get a referendum going, it actually created a two-pronged process in the vote. The first half of the ballot says, did you want to recall the governor? Well, if you said no, well, then that was it. But if you voted yes, I want to recall the governor, then you went to the bottom half of the ballot, and then you chose from a list of those that were seeking to replace the governor if the governor was recalled. And if the governor was ultimately recalled, then they counted the votes for those that put in as candidates to replace said governor. Well, in 2002, the sitting governor was recalled. And the person that ended up getting the most votes of the people that put in as possible replacements for the governor was actor Arnold Schwarzenegger. Yes, that is how he actually becomes governor of the state of California via a recall. In recent years, we've seen attempts to use a recall to remove the governor of Wisconsin. That failed. And speaking of California's Governor Gavin Newsom, just in the last year, also survived a recall attempt in that state. Now, the thing you got to keep in mind with initiatives, referendums, and recalls, once again, these are all state powers. There is no such thing as a federal initiative. There is no such thing as a federal referendum, nor a federal recall. These are all state issues. So if you don't like, the President of the United States, there's no national recall. You got to wait till the next election. Now, also keep in mind that since these are state-level powers, different states offer some of these things. Some of these states offer all three of these things. Some of them offer none of these things. It just depends on the state that you live in. Like, for example, here in Ohio, as I mentioned, we have referendum power, but we don't have recall power. So if you don't like what the governor's doing, you got to wait till the next election. I think we're going to leave it right there for now. When we come back, we'll take a look at some other political reforms. We'll see you next time.